Sure, I can respond. So the Prime Minister committed to develop the CAP. We put out a discussion paper on different approaches. We then put out a regulatory framework, and the minister is committed to publish a draft of the regulations. So as you know, these regulations always have to be published twice in draft form and then in final form. And the minister is committed to publish the draft regulations this fall for comment. So we're very close to the final design of the draft regulations based on about a year of extensive engagement with various experts in the sector and our own internal analysis.
Thank you, Mr. Moffat. And could you maybe just provide some details to this committee about why this process has taken as long as it has? Because I understand this may be longer than a lot of folks, including myself, would have liked to see from it. And I'd be curious to hear why the consultations and this process has taken this length of time.
So I know we've seen commentary from the commissioner and others about the length of time to develop regulations. And while I think the government would, and as my colleague, the deputy minister, has acknowledged, there is urgency to address climate change, I take serious issue with any allegation or assertion that the speed at which we've developed these regulations has been slower than usual or slower than could be expected. In fact, for a regulation of this magnitude, I think we're moving considerably faster than would have been the case if you look at kind of the normal pace at which we develop regulations of this kind. As I said, we've moved from a general commitment to a discussion paper to a regulatory framework to draft regulations in the pace of a couple of years, which is faster than has been our track record for many different kinds of regulations. And we regulate air, water, soil, greenhouse gas. The last thing I'll say about this is that while one metric of success in terms of a regulation is how fast we get it out, I think equally important is ensuring that we have a well-informed, well-designed regulation that can stand the test of time. And,
thank you.
That's our goal.
Thank you very much. I'm going to suspend the meeting now for votes, and I'll bring it back into order right after those votes, and we'll continue with Madame Secrétaire de Gagné. This meeting is suspended. Call this meeting back into session. Just to update everyone, we'll have about another 15 minutes of questions, at which point I will excuse the witnesses, thank and excuse witnesses, and there is just some very brief business to conduct, which will be neither controversial nor lengthy. Madame Sinclair Desgagnés, vous avez 2 minutes.
You have 2.5 minutes, Madame Sinclair Desgagnés. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to ask Mr. Conrad a question. I would like you to have appeared without speaking. At 6.8 of the report, it refers to your responsibilities in terms of climate change. You are responsible for putting in place mitigation measures. You have to support the minister in the coordination of his climate change plan. So when I gave the figures earlier of the participation of the government in the Environment Department's budget, which was $7 billion compared to $56 billion that was given to the oil and gas sector, do you not find that in supporting climate change, the Privy Council is doing one thing with one hand and another on the other, or is that just greenwashing?
Just if I can kind of back it up just a little bit to explain kind of my role in the system, and I think that will clarify kind of how the Privy Council office fits in. So I have a responsibility to help manage collective decision making through the cabinet process. We provide advice, to the Prime Minister, but we do not take over individual ministers' line responsibilities and accountabilities. We do not make spending decisions ourselves on specific items. We play a role to bring parties together. We ensure that the right information comes to ministers for consideration, that things are properly vetted, they're properly analyzed, but we leave it to the individual line ministers to manage individual
Merci, Monsieur
programs.
Conrad. Mon temps est limité.
Thank you, Mr. Conrad. We've learned in CEGEP or even in high school that when we have objectives, they have to be smart, specific, measurable, realistic, and defined over time. So do you consider that when you support, in this case, the government, generally speaking, in its policy on climate change, that it's acting in a smart way?
So I assure, Mr. Chair, I assure that all proposals coming through the cabinet process meet strict criteria in terms of considerations. We don't use that specific terminology, but we have a very detailed set of considerations.
Et pourtant, le rapport du commissaire montre que
And yet the commissioner's report shows that all of those criteria of good policy are not respected. So what is your role within that? Are you going to do something for our policies on climate change? Or are you going to do something so that they're not just a one-way street, everything sent to the oil and gas sector? Or are we going to do something to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and us being the joke of the G7? Which is it going to be?
So I have a great deal of confidence, Mr. Chair, in the internal process to ensure that all factors that go into collective decision making are there. The report of the commissioner, which I respect and we have agreed with the recommendations, is about us trying to improve our processes and bring greater clarity on accountabilities. And we have moved forward with an integrated climate lens, which is something that's part of a cabinet directive that has been publicly released. And we're committed to being transparent on the results of that work, and I have a great deal of confidence that we are on the right track, and we will use the report and the recommendations of the Commissioner to help improve our processes.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup. Suivant.
Thank you very much. Next, we have the NDP. Will it be you, Ms. Barron? Lisa Marie Baron. You have 2 minutes and 30 seconds.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to the witnesses. I'm happy to be here and covering for my colleague. Now, my time is short, so I want to make sure I get some questions in here. First and foremost, there's some benefits to coming in from somebody who's not a regular member to be able to see things more from a bird's eye view and to be able to figure out, what are the most important questions that I'm hearing from Canadians. And one thing that is being brought to my attention is, despite the fact that we are clearly in a climate emergency, that we are feeling the impacts. I'm from Vancouver Island. My riding is Nanaimo Ladysmith, and we've seen firsthand the impacts of the wildfires, the impacts of flooding, the heat dome that hit us. People in my riding are paying attention to the fact that we are in a climate crisis. Now, we need to see federal action from all departments. And one thing that I'm being asked about is the fact that, okay, we have the Minister of Environment, but why are we not getting all departments to have front of mind a priority of addressing the climate crisis? This isn't just the Environment Minister's job. This is the Housing Minister. This is the Fisheries Minister. This is the Health Minister. This is everybody's job to make sure that we're all moving in the right direction. And so I think my question to the Commissioner perhaps is the best person to answer is, what would his suggestion be to see a government that's taking this as serious as it needs to be, and to see that that comprehensive response being taken rather than a patchwork approach that's currently being taken?
Yes, I'll take, in answering that question, I'll take us back to perhaps my first appearance before this committee a couple of years ago, the Lessons Learned on Climate Change report from our office in 2021. Lesson number 1, stronger leadership and coordination are needed to drive progress toward climate commitments. So we've had a fragmented approach now for 30 years in Canada without good results. Our emissions are considerably higher now than when we started this endeavor. So continuing to do the same thing but expecting different results is not a good approach. So I think somewhat inadvertently, some of the responses you've heard from the departments today have reinforced our point that continued siloed approaches do not work. At least that's in the experience on climate and perhaps on biodiversity as well in Canada. So a stronger leadership and coordination, that's the reason we made it lesson number 1 in that report from 2021. And we yet to see that tangibly occurring in Canada with respect to climate change. There's still a fragmented approach, a not my department approach, a siloed approach.
If you have a brief question, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. My final question perhaps will be to the Deputy Minister of Environment, Tremblay. Can you please share, and perhaps you can follow up in writing if we don't have time today, around the assertion that certain First Nation representatives are saying that the 2030 plan did not take into account the standards of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, when we know Indigenous people have been stewards of the land since time immemorial. Any comment on that?
Thank you, Mr. President, for the question. The development of the emission reduction plan stems from the requirements of the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, which requires that the Government of Canada engages with provinces and territories, but also Indigenous partners. As part of the emission reduction plan, there actually is an annex specifically dedicated to all 3 distinction-based groups, providing input. That being said, we recognize we have to do better. But on that front, the emission reduction plan does take into and reflect submissions from Indigenous partners.
Thank you very much. Next is Mr. Stewart for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, a question to Mr. Conrad. The government is claiming the emission reduction target of their $8 billion net zero accelerator fund is, and I quote, protected under cabinet confidence, seeing as your role is with the Privy Council's office. Can you explain why?
So, Mr. Chair, if the question is like, why are we protecting cabinet confidence? It's a legal requirement.
Excuse me, that's not the question. I'm asking why we protect information that should be public under cabinet confidence on this file in particular, the Net Zero Accelerator Fund.
So I can't speak to the specific program. I can speak in general that we do not have specific rules for release of different programs. We apply.
Can anybody from the Privy Council speak to this issue?
So I can speak to the cabinet confidence issue.
Yeah, that's not what I'm asking. Sorry, no,
to the specifics of the program. That is
that's
an
enough.
program.
That's enough. It's my floor now, not yours. My next statement I'm going to make is, why would cabinet choose to conceal under a shroud of secrecy their own target, public information, from the taxpayer? So I'm going to go ahead and ask over here to Jean-Francois Tremblay, Deputy Minister, Department of the Environment. You said earlier that you can't release the information. Is it that you can't release it or you won't release it? Those are 2 different things. Just the answer, can't or won't.
If you refer to the, just need specificity. If you refer to the information that they said was under cabinet secret, cabinet confidentiality, I can't release it if it's under cabinet confidentiality.
Okay, so it's can't then. So I have another piece of paper here from the Parliamentary Budget Officer, where you, on behalf of Honourable Stephen Guilbeault, Minister of Environment and Climate Change, you put a gag order on Mr. Yves Giroux, the PBO officer, and you said, I request you to ensure that this information is used for your office's internal purposes only and is not published or further distributed. So that is your signature on this. You're gagging the Parliamentary Budget Officer on behalf of your minister. So if the answer is can't rather than won't at this point, so who instructed you that you couldn't release it?
Okay, just a few things. One
question.
No, but you have the right to ask the questions you want, but you're not going to gag me. I should be able to answer.
I'm not trying to gag you. I'm asking a question.
Yes.
No, hold on. I want to point out something. Mr. Chair, it's important. A lot of questions earlier, you said that you just couldn't answer it because that wasn't your purview. I expect an answer.
Yes, I'm answering. first of all, we didn't gag him because we gave him all the information that he needs to develop his own analysis. So there was nothing there that was actually not provided to Yves Giraud. So that's the first thing to say. Now,
You said PBO officer couldn't release it. That's
what we told them is we requested not to
Excuse me, I just read what you told him. You told him, I request you to ensure that this information is used for your office's internal purposes only, not published or further distributed. You told him he couldn't put it out, precisely.
because the information has not been vetted in terms of protections from a legal perspective, could be protected under certain act, and also because it was never released. We asked him to not release it. So we give him the confidential information and say, use it for your analysis. As I said to your colleagues, the issue of releasing this information or those data or not, it's a decision for governments to make.
That's great. Back to my initial point. Who instructed you to carry out this letter to the PBO, and who instructed
Has
you?
restricted me to
Who
do that.
instructed you that you could not release the information?
Advice from the departments, and to be fair with you, this is something we've been doing.
Hold on.
for
Hold on. You were advised by the department, but over here you're saying it was cabinet confidence. Which is it?
No, that's two different.
Yeah, exactly. Two different answers to the same question.
No,
I
it's
agree
not
with
the
you.
same
No, I agree
question.
with you.
The
It's two
questions
different
was-
answers to
The
the
other
same question. Another question.
I
Was
never
it the
pretended
Prime
it
Minister, the Minister of the Environment, or the Minister of Industry who put the gag in the cabinet? Who did that? Who instructed you that you couldn't release public information?
This information has nothing to do with the Net Zero Accelerator. This is information coming from Environment Canada. This is not cabinet. We never pretend it was cabinet confidential. What we said was that the information, as you read in the letter, was unpublished. That's what we said. And may have.
Okay, that's right. If it's not cabinet confidence, you can release it then.
As I said before to your colleagues, there's a due diligence to be made in terms of, is it information that should be protected on certain legislation?
You just said yourself that you could release it if it wasn't cabinet confidence. Which is it? You guys are going to have to start coming in
No,
here
I'm
and
telling
learn to
you,
be accountable.
we
None
are-
of you want to be accountable,
Yes, we are
and people are
accountable
watching
under-
it too.
This is the accountability under the Federal
Yeah, well, answer the question.
Accountability Act.
Answer the question.
There's more than one legislation that actually manage confidentiality. So yes, we have to do the due diligence, and ultimately, it's a decision the governments can make
Answer the
of
question.
releasing.
And that is the time,
I
I'm
answered
afraid.
the question.
No, you're an
Stewart.
apologist for the government, and you
That
didn't
is
answer
the time,
anything.
Mr. Stewart. Up next is Mr. Morris, one of the government members. Well, Ms. Khalid. I was going to reference that Ms. Khalid has graciously.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to cede my time to Mr. Morrissey. Thank you.
Mr. Morris, you have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thank you, MP Khalid. I want to start by saying thanks to the Commissioner and to your team for the work you've been doing, starting with recognizing that in Exhibit 6.3 of the report being discussed this afternoon, you're helping Canadians to see that emissions have gone up in Canada since 1990, and actually we're the only G7 country for whom that is the case. Emissions in Canada, as of the most recent inventory report, have actually gone up 100 megatons since 1990. It was around 608 megatons in 1990 when we all decided we were going to start to care about the climate crisis, and it's about 708 megatons as of the most recent inventory report. Now, in your report, you've concluded that the measures the government has proposed to reduce emissions by 2030 are insufficient to meet their target between 40 to 45%. I'll note that that target doesn't follow climate science, that we need to get to at least a 60% reduction by 2030, but we have actually started to go down in the last year. It's a 7% reduction in the last year at least. Where I'd like to ask questions is about the measures we need to see this government taking to go further and faster. Because on one hand, we have oil and gas CEOs who were at the Environment Committee last week, and they made very clearly themselves to parliamentarians, they have no interest in an oil and gas cap. They've got no interest in a windfall profit tax on their record-breaking excess profits. In fact, they have no interest in any additional regulations whatsoever. So that's oil and gas on one hand, significant emitter in this country. On the other, though, is that we have this draft framework for the oil and gas cap that has come out since this report did, and there are significant exemptions contained in it. including 25 megatons lost to compliance flexibilities, carbon offsets, essentially. And so, Commissioner, to you or Principal Leash, I'm wondering if you could share how important you think it is for this government to strengthen what was in the regulations, or if you can even speak broadly about how important do you see the oil and gas cap, this cap on emissions from the oil and gas sector, as it relates to making progress towards their 2030 target?
Thank you for the question. So you're absolutely right that Canada is the worst performer in the G7 since both 1990 and since 2005, the two baseline years. What is needed is a collection of effective measures that will meet or exceed the next target. We're not in the business of setting a target. You mentioned 60 or something else, but we're in the business of assessing performance towards the committed target, which is 40 to 45%. They need a package of measures, and it's their choice as to what the measures will be, that are effective and that will meet the target. How much they will get from each measure is up to the government to decide, but it has to be something that is at least 40%. And as I said earlier, because they've tended to miss their targets over the past 30 years, they may need to aim higher and then hope to get to the minimum of 40%.
And that's kind of my concern, is the aim with the oil and gas cap was to get 79 megatons of reductions. And with the draft framework that we now have, we're looking at maybe 34 megatons, so about half. So you're saying aim higher, and the draft regulations are telling Canadians that they're about half as much as they'd originally intended with the framework. Have you got any advice for government on the oil and gas cap framework, or any comment you'd like to make about that measure in terms of meeting our climate change goals?
Yeah, so if any of their measures is delayed or watered down in the consultation process, it means that all the more important to have other measures to fill in that gap. So if you diminish the scope of a measure, for example, as happened with the clean fuel regulations in terms of the evolution of that regulation, then you need to catch up somewhere else. We aren't in the business of prescribing what the full menu of measures will be, but the measures have to be in aggregate effective enough to meet the target.
Thank you, Commissioner. One last question is to Mr. Tremblay. I believe that my colleagues on the government side are well-intentioned in terms of working towards this target, and so I appreciate what we've heard from the Commissioner in terms of advice for them to work towards doing so. I know one of the critiques that the Commissioner has shared is a lack of coordination. And Mr. Tremblay, when I heard a colleague asking about that, I saw you kind of shaking your head earlier. And so could you maybe, I don't see it in this report, a response from Environment and Climate Change Canada. I know I'm low on time. And so could you table to this committee evidence that I assume you would purport to have that shows more coordination that the Commissioner has said is really important for us to meet our goals?
No, the reason I was raising that is that there is actually a lot of coordination. Is it perfect? No. This is a complex issue that everybody is responsible.
Sorry, I apologize to interrupt. I just expect to be cut off very soon. I'd ask, can you table, I understand your position, yeah. Can you table some evidence to the committee that demonstrates that what you're saying is the case?
We can respond by writing with some of the coordination that exists. Yes.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much. And thank you to Mr. DeMarco, Mr. Tremblay, and Mr. Conrad for your testimony and participation in relation to the study of Report 6, Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act 2030 Emission Reduction Plan. I will excuse you, please. We're going to continue with some little business here, but I'm not going to recess. I'll just thank you again and excuse you. And any